Good morning, I'm Read More Book, and this is my run and gun, poison stacking Pathfinder Endgame build overview. This is a run and gun build that plays like a twin stick shooter, using 3 of the physical ammo crossbow skills and pure evasion deflect as its defensive mechanism. The changes to Pathfinder this league really didn't impact the build in any significant negative way, and instead it has received buffs in the form of much stronger defenses through easily hitting the deflect cap, and a buff to the base single target damage of the build thanks to the change to fragmentation rounds adding 2 more fragments at 20% quality. The build revolves around 2 key mechanics. For clear, I'm stacking up a lot of poisons with armor piercing rounds and spreading them through Herald of Plague and Bursting Plague. This build scales up to do anything in the game, including 200% delirious maps, as you can see in the footage, and it's not even fully optimized. The buff to deflect makes the build tanky enough to handle all of the incoming damage in those maps, and I die so very rarely to the point where even in very juiced maps, I don't need to use the second revive from Doriani. For single target, I'm taking advantage of the interaction the Riven debuff from high velocity rounds has with fragmentation rounds for incredibly high single target damage. I'm currently doing over 8 million combined DPS at the top end of the build. The single target of this build is quite ridiculous, and it kills any pinnacle boss, even with 35% damage reduction from Jado combined with their own initial damage reduction in seconds, even when it's not fully scaled up to the full 8 million DPS that I've reached. I've made a few videos about this build already, so in this one I'm going to give you the tools to understand how the build works and why it's built the way that it is, key gearing choices and some crossbow crafting steps, and then a fast leveling setup if you want to play this as your second character. I'm trying something a bit different with how the build overview is laid out, so please let me know if you like this style or if you prefer the hideout run-through style of guide. If you have any questions, then please just ask in the comments below and I will answer. Otherwise, you can come and ask any questions you have when I'm live on YouTube and Twitch Sundays, Mondays and Tuesdays. First, I'll go over how the build works. Clearing is one button, armor piercing rounds, which uses a combination of the attacks chain and additional time desecrated modifier on crossbows with the Dominus Grasp lineage gem to ensure we hit as many enemies as possible without sacrificing the damage of our hits and subsequently our poisons. If you're doing very hard delirious and high effectiveness maps, then sometimes you may need to fire off a high velocity round to kill a tanky rare a bit quicker. Single target uses a rotation of skills. First, we fully break the enemy's armor with armor piercing rounds. Once the armor is fully broken and the enemy has at least 5 stacks of poison, we switch ammo types to high velocity rounds and hit them once to apply the Riven debuff. Riven adds an unscalable damage bonus to all subsequent hits against the target during its duration. This damage bonus is equal to 5% of the pre-mitigation damage of high velocity rounds. Once Riven is applied, we use our second weapon set that has Rampart Raptor and Fragmentation rounds slotted in to attack as many times as possible. Somewhere between 9 and 10 times per second is relatively straightforward to achieve. Each hit from Fragmentation rounds is actually 12 hits, because each fragment counts as 1 hit for the purpose of the Riven debuff. This means 60% of your high velocity rounds damage 10 times per second. This is already a lot of damage, but now we get to the piece de resistance. The 12 hits from fragmentation rounds are merged into a single hit after the damage is calculated, and this hit applies a poison stack. We are using Pathfinder and 5 sources of additional poison stacks to give us a total of 12 poisons on the enemy, which at the low end of the build doubles our DPS and at the top end of the build quadruples it. The reason this works is because of the unscalable part of the Riven damage. It means we can use supports that give huge bonuses like attack speed and poison magnitude in exchange for dealing much less damage. But because the Riven damage is unscalable, we don't actually lose that damage, but we get to keep the bonus. I kept track of my single target damage progression as I upgraded the build, and you can see that even before the high investment version of the build, you can easily reach more than 3 million DPS, which, trust me, is plenty of damage. I need to use this spreadsheet to work out the average damage of fragmentation rounds because Path of Building doesn't currently support Riven. As you can see from some of the damage jumps, while plus skills are important, it's actually adding more damage multipliers in the form of Rizlatha's Coil and Berserk that really make the damage soar. For defenses, I started in early maps still using hybrid ES and evasion, as I was still using the previous league's version of this build. Then I decided I would test out pure evasion and deflect, and I'm glad I made the switch. With all the ground degens around, I actually often found myself without ES anyway, so I'd rather just use red life and always know where I stand health-wise, as well as not having to worry about getting sources of intelligence anymore. We make sure that we have life and deflect on all of our evasion gear pieces, and combine that with blind on attack and blind on wind dancer to hit the deflect cap of 95%, which makes us feel very safe. Anything that doesn't get one shot will be blinded and maimed. Some people claim that because of entropy and not being able to hit 100% deflect, that this defensive setup is unreliable. But the chance of a hit both getting through and not being deflected when you have 78% evade chance and 95% deflect chance is 1%. Then on top of that, the hit that gets through needs to be big enough to actually kill you. These sound like good odds to me, and the entropy resets after a few seconds anyway, so that big hit is not inevitable most of the time. In all content apart from the very hardest delirious maps with multiple damage modifiers, you are not going to get randomly one shot, as long as you're not walking face first into slams. At the higher investment levels of the build, I'd also recommend a Spirit of the Bear rite of passage for more life and reduced damage taken. I'd also recommend having a little bit of life leech, life on hit, or life on kill to help keep you topped up, but it's not going to save you from heavy damage. You will want a partial or fully instant flask for when you do take a big hit now and again. So that's how the build works. Now I'm going to go through how the build is set up in the endgame along with your options when you're looking for upgrades. Personally, I don't mind swapping gems and spirit reservations for pinnacle bosses, so I keep a single target setup around by storing support gems in my crossbow shot, and I keep my +3 high velocity rounds Prism of Belief in my inventory, just so I can see how fast bosses go down when I feel like it. I don't do gem swaps for map bosses, and they still go down in seconds through their damage reduction phase. If you just want to leave the clear setup in for everything, then it will work just fine, but I'm going to go through each of the setups for you anyway. For the clear setup, we want to be hitting lots of enemies because Herald of Plague only transfers 1 poison per enemy, but those poisons can all stack up, so you'll want to be sacrificing the least amount of hit damage to do this. The best option then is the Desecrated Attacks Chain and Additional Time modifier, as this has no damage penalty. If for some reason you cannot do the desecration on your weapon, then the second best option is Fork, because the damage penalty only applies to the forked projectiles and not the initial hit. There is a cluster on the tree that gives an extra projectile when forking that you'll be pathing near anyway, so pick this up for some extra clear speed if you do go that route. Don't use the chain support. The damage penalty is too high, so wait until you can get the mod on your weapon. If you cannot afford the top end lineage gems, it really doesn't matter. You can just swap Arakali's Lust into armor piercing rounds for mapping and put it back into high velocity rounds for bossing, and you can use Brutality instead of Rigwald's in high velocity rounds. All you really lose by using Brutality is the poison on HVR, which, while significant, doesn't make a difference to your overall DPS. Eternal Rage, Wind Dancer, and Herald of Plague is the core setup for reservations. You can stack more Spirit and add Berserk for your 200% maps, but you don't need it, and if you do that, you'll need to make sure that you can mitigate the life loss through things like Life Leech, Life on Hit, or Life on Kill. If I was going to prioritize anything first in this build, it would be improving clear damage and speed. That's because the single target setup is easy and you'll not have any issues scaling the damage as long as you're doing the rotation correctly. As you can see from the fragmentation round supports, most of them have a reduced damage modifier. The beauty of this build is that it doesn't matter because Riven damage is unscalable. If you want to see bosses melt even faster, you can turn off Herald of Plague and turn Berserk on in weapon set 2 and Attrition on in weapon set 1. We don't need Berserk active on fragmentation rounds as it won't actually change the damage we are doing, so we'll stop losing health as soon as we switch to our second weapon. You won't lose much health in the time it takes you to break armor and apply Riven, but the damage bonus is massive. Attrition is active on weapon set 2 here, but realistically, bosses will die long before it actually does anything once you've scaled the build up a bit. Eternal Rage and Wind Dancer remain active for single target assigned to both weapon sets. As I already said, the basic rotation is armor piercing rounds until the armor is fully broken, followed by high velocity rounds to apply Riven, and then spam fragmentation rounds until either Riven wears off or the enemy dies. Normally, the enemy dies. If you want to, you could also add an emergency reload assigned to the same weapon set as APR and HVR before you fire off high velocity rounds for even more damage, but it's completely unnecessary, and I don't bother with it at any stage of the build. At the top end of the build, it would push the build to over 10 million DPS, but I can't say that I'd even be able to count how much faster that is for killing bosses. Now let's look at gearing. The cornerstone of any martial build is the weapon, and depending on your budget, you'll likely go through 3 tiers of crossbow. At the first level, we have the basic craft that will serve you for a lot of the endgame. Just having a high physical DPS weapon will ensure your single target can take down bosses very easily, and it's easy enough to make. Any tier 2 physical percentage desolate crossbow plus a greater essence of abrasion will do it. Then you can suffix craft an Ulaman modifier to get the attack chain and additional time modifier. Fill the rest of the mods up with greater exalts and maybe you'll get lucky and hit a jackpot roll. When you want to start pushing more damage to increase the difficulty of your maps and kill bosses even quicker, then you can upgrade to a crossbow with more skill levels. This will cost whatever the current price of Astrid's creativity is, which you can slot in to add a second crafted modifier, and then you can replace it when you're done. The order of operations is to greater essence of abrasion, dextral crystallization, a perfect essence of battle with Astrid slotted in, then do the suffix desecration and fill the rest of the affixes with greater exalts. Finally, we get the weapon that uses the natural roll for skill levels to let us use a second crafted modifier instead for Gainer's extra fizz. This modifier is so powerful that it lets a 700 DPS weapon compete with a 1000 DPS weapon for how much damage it can put out, and it's arguably so much easier to create. This is the weapon that will allow you to easily farm 200% delirious maps if that's what you want to do. The first steps are the same, greater abrasion and desecrate a suffix, but before you reveal the desecrated mod, you'll need to try and fracture the plus projectile levels. If it misses, then you can decide if you still want to gamble the dextral crystallization and a perfect essence of abrasion. I would use a dextral exaltation and a greater exalt, and then you have a 66% chance to still finish the craft. But if you don't want to risk wasting the crossbow base and the Astrid's creativity, then sell your failure and try again. If the fracture hits, then you can't ruin the crossbow anymore. Just dextral a perfect essence of abrasion and you'll have all of the prefixes filled, and 2 of the suffixes are done. You can then greater exalt and try and hit something good. I ended up using a few omens of whittling on the one I'm using until I hit life leech and decided to just stick with that. There are only 2 cheap uniques that I would say are necessary for the build to function: Snakebite Gloves and Rampart Raptor. Snake bites give us a high base poison chance and a free extra poison stack to double with the Pathfinder Ascendancy. Rampart Raptor has a special ability to not spend ammunition after you reload, and that's what gives us such an insanely high attack rate during the Riven debuff for fragmentation rounds. You don't need to Rune Master Rampart Raptor because the base damage does not matter at all. The only thing that matters is how many sockets it has, so you can fit more skill or attack speed augments into it alongside the Idol of Thraldana. Then we have some uniques that are not necessary but add a lot of power to the build. Rizlatha's is best in slot for damage in any high physical damage build. The most important number here is the maximum physical number, and I'll go over why in the next section. Lavianja's Wisdom both helps with mana sustain and gives us access to a couple of very powerful nodes on the passive tree to increase our attack speed with our fragmentation rounds and our damage with APR and HVR. You can only have 1 Prism of Belief slotted at a time, and I generally just keep my armor piercing round 1 slotted all the time unless I want to see how fast I can melt a pinnacle boss. These get cheaper as the league goes on. +2s should always be affordable, but early in the league a +3 can be very pricey. If you have the spare divines or you get very lucky and find one, then I would also very much recommend slotting in a Spirit of the Bear Rite of Passage. It gives more life, more stun threshold, and reduced damage taken while it's up, which will really help when you're pushing difficult maps. Finding a good Rizlatha's is a very big damage boost to both single target and clear. The bigger the gap between the higher maximum fizz and the lower minimum fizz number, the better. But the most important number is the more maximum physical roll. Adding a Rizlatha's will add some variance to your average damage, and the smaller the gap between the 2 numbers, the bigger the variance will be. There may be times, because of the way it increases the range of damage, that you'll hit less than you would without it, but really you're just looking at the difference between instantly vaporizing the boss and taking 5 seconds to kill it. Rizlatha's are very cheap this league, but let's assume that they've gotten very expensive for some reason and all you can afford is a 40/40, which will be the floor. We can see why it's still a very big damage increase. Your maximum damage is higher than your minimum, so even at 40% more max and 40% less minimum, starting with a damage base of let's say 50 to 100, you gain 40 max damage, but you only lose 20 minimum damage. So your damage range goes from 50 to 100 to 30 to 140. So your average hit goes from 75 to 85, which is still a 13.33% increase. The maximum multiplier is also a more multiplier, so it is multiplicative with all of our other damage sources, including something like heft. Let's take a look at the rares I'm using on the build. Firstly, we'll have a look at the rings. Thankfully, for this build, our rings aren't too expensive because the only damage roll we care about is flat physical. At a minimum, you'll want T2 flat fizz and max life, and then just whatever resistances you need. If you can afford evasion rating, then that'll also help your survivability. When you're looking for a source of spirit, it will be cheaper to get a good chest with 60 spirit than it will to get a +3 projectile amulet with 60 spirit, or an amulet with eternal rage already allocated. We can also then get some very good defensive rolls on the amulet itself. You want to get deflect as a suffix on all of your evasion gear so that we can reach the deflect cap. Try and get good life rolls as much as you can, and a little bit of strength won't hurt either if you've got a spare suffix. The move speed rune is only used if you don't need the rune slot for resistances or defensive on your boots. For the anoint priority, Crushing Verdict is the best anoint, followed by Dangerous Blossom in my opinion. There are other cheaper options out there which are still good. The very budget option is Heavy Ammunition. Spray and Pray is also an option, but the bonus is only active while you're moving, and the accuracy penalty does hurt in hard content like 200% delirious maps. I just want to also briefly cover the difference between chance to poison and chance to inflict ailments. These are very different in the way that they work. Each instance of chance to poison is added to your total chance to poison. So, 2 8% chance to poison nodes is 16% total chance to poison. Chance to inflict ailments is additive with itself and then multiplicative with chance to poison. Chance to inflict ailments therefore only functions when you already have a base chance to poison, and it's also much less valuable. An 8% chance to poison node plus a 10% chance to inflict ailments node is only an 8.8% chance to poison. You want to be getting as close to 100% as you can get to ensure that you're keeping up all of your poison stacks easily, but anything above 90% and the build will work just fine. Remember that chance to poison only affects the physical or chaos damage part of your damage by default. You can scale your poisons from elemental damage only by using something like Plague Finger's unique gloves, which obviously we don't use. We get a large initial chance to poison from the Snakebite gloves, which can roll up to 30% uncorrupted, and then we get the rest from the passive tree and our jewels. I'm just going to go over some of the important aspects of the passive tree now. In weapon set 1, you want to take as many attack speed nodes as you can get, and then in weapon set 2, take the physical and attack damage nodes. Poison scaling nodes apply to both weapon sets because the poison is the only part of fragmentation rounds we can actually scale. We want chance to poison, number of stacks, magnitude, and duration, and these all combine with the overwhelming toxicity ascendancy nodes. The duration part of this is more for clear than it is for single target. You won't really struggle with single target, but as you push into much harder content, you want to be making sure you're scaling your reach and your damage, especially for delirious content. We do want to take some evasion and deflection nodes on the tree to beef up our defenses. Thankfully, we passed by most of the powerful and efficient ones when we were traveling around to the poison clusters. I also like to take a little bit of movement speed to help with clear speed, and it pairs quite nicely with the running assault ascendancy node. When it comes to leveling through the campaign, if you're doing a fresh start, then follow my Mobalytics guide, and I would recommend swapping to the poison setup as late as you can, when you have a really good physical DPS crossbow in Act 4 and have all of the needed passive tree points and support gems to make the best use of poison. You can see the progression in the written version of this guide. If this is your second character in a league and you just want to get back to the endgame as fast as possible, then I would buy a set of unique gear like you can see here and speed through the campaign with galvanic shards and fragmentation rounds. I did this recently on my gemling and I was in T15s in 6 hours, and then I swapped to my new build around level 78. Just make sure you're keeping your runes up to date, and if you can find some leveling weapons with 3 sockets then you'll be even faster. You can rune forge both weapons at level 38 for a big damage boost, and then you can rune master Rampart Raptor at level 55 if you want that to carry you all the way into maps. I'm no speedrunner, but I'm very happy with a 6-hour run to T15s for a second character, and I'm going to see if I can bring this down to 5 in my next run. Well, that's it for the build overview. The next video will be a build guide for my Tornado Gemling that I've been streaming for the past few days, and it has been crushing all of the content I throw at it. After this, I'm going to be moving on to building something a bit spicy with the Martial Artist. After that, I may come back to Gemling to try out scaling up Arc, as I already have all of the mana and quality stacking gear for it. As always, if you enjoy my videos, please like, comment and subscribe to help my channel reach more people. I stream Sundays, Mondays and Tuesdays on YouTube and Twitch. You're welcome to come hang out, or if you want to ask me any questions about my builds or build making in general. Thanks for watching, bye!